primary verses I'm going to use for this video are verses 1 through 4 from 1 Corinthians 7, but I'll need to start with the traditional interpretation of verse 9. Well, actually, I'm going to challenge the traditional masculine interpretation. The reason I'm starting with verse 9 is because over the years, it's the one that caused me a lot of confusion and grief. It didn't make sense when I considered it with verses 1 through 4. But no one could ever explain it to me, and because I was gullible, I just believed the church leadership when they said, sex is what you do in marriage. God gave men huge sexual appetites, so sex is just what you do. But you know what? They were wrong. Now that I understand it for myself, that's where I want to start with you all. Verse 9 says, "But if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it's better to marry than burn with desire." The masculine mindset reads that and thinks, a man who wants to have unlimited and free access to sex should get married. That might be what those English words say, but that's not what Paul means here. He's not saying that because a man decides he's not going to exercise self-control, that instead he can bring that lack of sexual self-control and lay it before a woman and make it her responsibility. And he's not saying that marriage obligates a wife to feed a man's sexual entitlement. But you know what? Let's play it through. Let's assume that the English has translated it honestly. Just for the moment, let's assume it's exactly what Paul meant and accept it as truth. After marriage, a man's lack of self-control with sexual responsibility is now the woman's responsibility because she agreed to marry him. And so that entitles a husband to a veritable buffet of sexual favors. But if we're going to lean that hard into literal translation in one verse, you've got to do it for all verses. Let's stick with Paul and compare scripture to scripture. We'll take Ephesians 4:25. Here he says that you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully, not deceiving one another. Paul's stating the importance of transparency and truth when you're building community. Isn't marriage a community of two? So if there's problems with sex in the marriage, the questions should start with, did the man make this truth evident to the woman? Was he clear that it was going to be primarily a sex-based marriage, that the reason he was getting married was because of his lack of self-control? Was he transparent about the reason he was marrying her, and that as soon as they were married, it was going to become her responsibility to quench that in him 7 days a week for the next 30 to 40 years? No, I can guarantee you he did not, because no woman would sign up for that condition. Paul knows that about femininity. He's saying that marriage merely sanctifies the action of intercourse. That's it. He's not talking about quantity or quality. He's saying that within the covenant of marriage, sex is made holy and legal in God's eyes. That's all. Verse 9 simply means if you're going to want to have sex and God is your father, it's going to cost you more than it costs people of the world. If you're chosen by God, things don't get easier, they get harder. It's how he sanctifies us. Christianity has completely misrepresented Paul's intentions, and as a result, Christian marriage is understood more like an unspoken agreement that's reduced to a sense of male-centric sexual entitlement. So we've been trapped because we listen to the same masculine interpretation but in various forms of English translations, because we don't trust ourselves. And that means we fail to interpret the scriptures with our feminine heart and mind, using the original languages that God chose to speak to us in. So, because we don't know the truth, we get trapped in misogynistic thinking, believing that marriage is predicated on masculinity, sexuality, to the exclusion of the feminine creature. Let me define what I mean by misogynistic thinking. I don't mean by the fact of being a man that means you think like a misogynist, because there are women who think that way too. Let me tell you, there are lots of sisters touting the Proverbs 31 wife mantra. Women so brokenhearted that their girlish femininity is crushed under a huge payload of shame and self-loathing. They're the ones who embrace the relentless drive of the excellent wife mindset, fueled by every ounce of testosterone in their body, thinking they're being feminine. What I mean is that misogynistic thinking is to place the importance of masculinity above femininity. But more than that even, it's the primacy and power of masculinity pushing femininity into its shadow until she's minimized into inconsequential worthlessness.
You're just a silly girl.
When you push a one-flesh relationship into the roles that are strictly for the function of the marriage, the misogynist perspective increases. Masculinity assumes primacy over femininity by using the authority in his role to prioritize his needs and desires. This dominance leads to erasing the feminine feelings and emotions that live inside a wife's femininity. This forces all of a woman's femininity to disappear underneath the weight of masculinity. Because men have 90% testosterone, that's a lot of power, and women have only 10. A man's perspective dominates. So the interpretation of 1 Corinthians 7:9 becomes about the supposed greater desire. I say supposed because the female body has got a much larger capacity by design than men. It's just different.